Hey everyone! So this is going to be a bit of a small review to give you an indication as to what Team Sonic Racing is like. I'm not going to go too much into detail like I normally would do in this video, but I should cover most of the important things. For well over 10 years, Sumo Digital have been on a major roll with their handling of Sega licenses. Following the release of the almighty Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing Transformed, fans have been demanding a sequel to that game, and with the release of Team Sonic Racing nearly 7 years later, the question is, does it have the same quality and the same magic as those previous two Sumo Digital Sonic Racing titles? The short answer is yes, but it does have a few issues, and some which I'd like to talk about in this video. I'm playing this game on a standard PS4, and it was purchased by myself. I'm going to open this review by talking about the major attraction to this title, and that's the gameplay. Whilst this is the third Sonic Racing title from Sumo Digital, it doesn't feel like a sequel to Transformed, or even to the original All-Stars Racing. Transformed felt like a development of the racing formula, and an extension to what was already a successful game. TSR, however, it feels almost like a spin-off to the original All-Stars game, and not a sequel to it, or a sequel to Transformed for that matter. The greatest reason for this is due to the core gameplay. Whilst previous racing titles put the emphasis on the individual's ability and performance, TSR splits the emphasis across an entire team's efforts. In TSR, the players race in a team of 3. The overall performance of the team will influence their final position. For example, if one player in a team finishes the race in first place, but the other 2 players come joint last, that overall team will likely come 3rd or 4th overall. On paper, this sounds completely absurd. Why should I then lose the race? But in execution, it works, and the reality is, in both single and multiplayer modes, it's actually quite good, and it works incredibly well. So let's just focus on multiplayer for starters. How many times have you played a racing game, either with friends or strangers, and there's always that one opponent who always wins? They're so good at the game, they just seem to win everything. Now at first, you're kind of determined to beat that player, but eventually, as more and more races go by, it just doesn't become fun anymore. Everyone knows that guy is either going to win or be positioned really well, and eventually you just either quit the game or leave the lobby or just don't want to play it anymore, because why would you? The same guy is always winning because it's his favourite game. It's his game, he knows how to play it. It becomes frustrating on everyone else, and the game just doesn't become fun anymore. Well, with TSR, this is no longer an issue, because you see, if that one guy does win, unless he works with the other players on his team, he's not going to win the overall race. Or you can join with that player and take on incredibly tough AI opponents, or even go online and take on other human players yourself. Now everyone is having fun because everybody is working together to try and come out on top. Or you have to also factor in your other AI players in order to beat the other guy. Even if you come last in the race, you can still potentially beat that other player who is faster as a single individual user. And for single player mode, the team play mechanic means that you have to treat your whole team as an extension of yourself. You end up being a force of 3 players. For example, if you pick up an item box, you may find it more beneficial to pass it to one of your AI controlled teammates. This means you have to keep a mental note of their position on the course throughout the race in order to treat your team like a single individual force to try and beat your rivals. And there are also other tricks you can do to help your team, such as driving in your teammate's slipstream, passing by a slower moving teammate, which will give them a quick boost in speed, as well as going on the offensive and ramming other players out of the way, whilst you take a speed penalty yourself and the other person you rammed into takes a speed penalty. Your team might gain some places, which benefits you in the long run. And another thing you might want to consider is you might want to take a slower route on the track, but by doing so, this might benefit your team in the long run, depending on the character type you pick. So let's talk about the subject of character types in this game. The game has 3 distinct race types. There's speed, power, and technique. Speed characters are exactly what they sound like. They have the highest top speed, they can boost faster, but they're quite weak to weapons. Power characters can crash into other players and break down barriers with no speed penalty, but they control really poorly. Technique characters, on the other hand, are the most interesting ones and the ones which I think really good players will pick. For instance, they can drive on water, lava, ice, and other rough surfaces without a speed or control penalty. And in early stages, you might cut a short corner and gain half a second on your opponent, but in later stages, you can cut entire sections of the track and take radically different routes without much of a hindrance. But the key issue is, if you're a technique character and you take a major shortcut over rough terrain, if you're in the lead, your slipstream will go into this area and your team cannot follow you, otherwise their speed will be reduced and they will likely lose positions, which will be harmful to your final position overall. This means you're constantly playing the game tactically, you're constantly thinking, your plans are dynamically changing as you're playing the game. Whilst you might be able to take a huge shortcut, you need to consider your team. If you're in the lead, can they follow you? Can you afford to take that shortcut if the rest of your team are so far behind? Or do you play a more slower and offensive game? Do you try and slow down the other racers in order to help your team? Or do you try and break away from the other players and then pick up weapons and then pass those weapons back further down to your other teammates in order for them to try and take out the other players? And this is where part of the intensity and the enjoyment comes from. You're constantly thinking about the race and multiple players, not just yourself. Playing this game as you would play the original ASR or even ASRT will likely result you in losing the race. Unless you play on normal difficulty, which I found sapped virtually all the challenge from the game. So you definitely want to pick the harder difficulty setting and get your money's worth. And then if you're feeling very brave, take on the expert challenge. And with all this in mind, it's hard to call Team Sonic Racing a sequel to either the original ASR or even All Stars Racing Transformed. It feels like a completely new experience, a spin-off to the spin-off series. In terms of how the character types differ from one another, you can really feel the difference when you play. Each class radically differs from one another, and you can just feel the difference regardless as to which character you pick. So I'm now going to talk about modifications for your vehicle. As you play through the game, you can unlock performance mods for your car, which greatly change your vehicle's stats. And in this game, you can really feel the difference they make. Whilst the changes are quite striking in terms of cosmetic appearance, they greatly impact the control and the performance of your character. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later on, because whilst the performance mods are incredibly powerful, I'm not a huge fan of how you actually unlock these mods, but the mods themselves do impact the gameplay, and you won't ever be thinking, is this actually doing anything? You can tell it impacts the characters. I'm now going to give a very brief note about the visuals. TSR is a very lovely game to look at. Even in motion, the game looks great. And even on a standard PlayStation 4, I only really noticed a frame rate drop on one occasion, and that was during one of the side missions you can do. Otherwise, the game looks and runs really, really well. It's a beautiful game to look at, and technically it also runs very well. Every Sonic game should look just as beautiful as this game does. Moving on to the OST, the music in this game, like with all previous Sumo Digital Sonic races, is just outstanding. The track remixes and the returning favourites give TSR a diverse range of music. Whilst in a race, you'll have a pumping soundtrack, which really helps increase the intensity of the race. In the adventure mode, the world map is a more relaxed tone, which sometimes I find myself just leaving the game on this menu just so I can listen to the music, mainly because of how relaxed and enjoyable it is. So I'm going to talk about the story mode now. The game has a story mode of sorts, and it's not the best story ever told. But I wanted to briefly mention it because, my goodness, the voice acting and the actual dialogue between the characters might be some of the best we've had in a Sonic game for years. Yeah, there are a few howlers and awkward moments here and there, but overall, in terms of the banter between the characters and the actual vocal delivery, it's really well done. I can't really pick a weak actor or a weak character. It's all done really well. It really puts the painful script of Sonic Forces and other big 3D Sonic games to shame. This was a really nice surprise. I'd now like to address the actual length of the game itself. In terms of how much content there is in the game, whilst it's true that the game only has 15 characters, there is a lot of actual content here for a single player, if you're aiming for 100% completion. If you play the game on normal difficulty, however, you will blitz through it and you will unlock everything very, very quickly. So do yourself a favour and put it on hard difficulty to give yourself a good challenge. That said, getting all the stars in adventure mode and unlocking all the performance mods, paint jobs and even vehicle horns is going to take you quite a long time. Some single player stages, which are effectively miniature challenge mode, such as a ring collection challenge, is going to take you hours to beat. These have one set difficulty and they really test your ability and skill at the game. Some of these stages can be near brutally hard and you'll be watching a lot of speedrun videos just to try and beat the time limits that they set. Another issue that I've seen people comment on during the build up to the release of this game was the number of returning tracks from previous racing installments. Whilst I shared some of the concern at the time, now that I've actually had chance to play these courses in Team Sonic Racing, I've got to say that this concern is just no longer an issue. Whilst All-Stars Racing and even All-Stars Racing Transformed had a recommended racing line for you to follow, which would normally give you a pretty good experience at a pretty quick time, even if you weren't the best player. Due to the nature of Team Sonic Racing, these racing lines they're no longer valid, and the experience you get from playing these tracks is just completely new and unique. And the reason for that is due to the new gameplay. Because you're now playing with 3 characters effectively in mind, the experience you get on these tracks is just wildly different to how you did when you approached them as a solo experience. So whilst I do really enjoy the game, I have to admit it does have a few odd problems. And whilst a lot of these problems I kinda have let slide since this is a budget title and I think it can be excused because of that, there are 2 major criticisms that I do have which I just can't ignore. And one of those is an incredibly questionable design choice, which I just find baffling as to why they've done this. Basically, when you pick adventure mode, which is this game's story mode, you're taken to a map screen and you're able to select what level you want to play. So how do you do this? Well, how do you do it in pretty much every single PlayStation 4 game that exists? You move over to which one you want, and you press the X button, and the level starts. So I was around halfway through the second world after several hours of play when it dawned on me I hadn't seen a single cutscene since the opening one. And I thought, this can't be right. Surely this can't be right. This is supposed to be story mode. Well, it turns out that if you press the X button, which, let's be honest, is normally the universal button to select anything on a PlayStation 4, the level starts, but it will skip all the dialogue and the story cutscenes. What you have to do is when you're on the map screen, you have to highlight which level you want to play, press the square button, then press the X button to start that level. If you don't do this, if you just press the X button, it will load up the level, but it will skip all the story cutscenes and dialogue. But this is story mode. I want to see the story. What makes this even more strange is even if you press the square button first and then the X button to actually start the level and see the story mode, there's an option in the dialogue to skip it. I would be not surprised in the slightest if a lot of players pick this game up and beat the entire adventure mode and not even realise there is actual story content here that they've missed, because they're approaching this as they would do any other game, and they've just not realised that you have to tell the game, yes, I want to watch the story mode when you're selecting a level. Now, I understand why they've done this. They've obviously done it to speed up the gameplay, and also so if you're replaying a level, you don't get the story mode each time. But the fact the story mode actually has an option in it that says skip story sequence, why is this even a thing? Another major criticism that I have with the game is how you unlock performance mods. Now, Sega's community team have been really stressing that these are not paid for microtransactions, and they're absolutely right, they're not. You earn credits in the game, and then you spend those credits on random loot boxes. Now, when you open a loot box, the loot box will either give you a performance mod, a paint job, a car horn, or a random single-use item. Fortunately, the drop rate for performance mods is quite generous, and more often than not, I actually get the legendary performance mods more than I do the standard ones. But these are still random, and you have no choice at all in which racer you get performance mods for. And it feels like 50% of the time, you get rewarded with a single-use item. Horns and paint jobs are by far the rarest items to get by a long way, meaning it's going to take a very long time of grinding enough of these coins to actually unlock everything. And in most cases, I can get roughly between, I think it's 30 and 40 coins per race, which lets me open between 3 and 4 loot boxes. I suppose it could have been a lot worse, but this is what I would call the absolute limit of what I would consider to be okay when it comes to randomized rewards. There is also another slight criticism I have with the performance mod system. Whilst the performance mods do alter your appearance and car's performance, it's clear that this has been done because they've been limited by Sega as to which characters they can use. It's kind of a compromise. But I wish it was more races that I could unlock. Pretty much most RPG and looter shooter developers know this issue too well. As a player, it's far more fun and rewarding when you complete a level or when you actually even open a loot box to be rewarded with new, better weapons than it is to be given materials to upgrade already existing weapons. I believe Extra Credits actually did a video explaining this. And this is the problem with Team Sonic Racing. You're not given new racers, you're given car parts. And whilst they do change the look of your character and change the performance, it's not the same wow moment that you got in All-Stars Racing Transformed when you unlocked new racers. For instance, most people in that game, the final racer that they will unlock is the car Aegis. And when you see that for the first time, and when you use it for the first time, the feeling and the reaction you get is huge. It's a major reward for the player. But in Team Sonic Racing, there's nothing even close to that moment in the whole game, regardless as to what you unlock via the loot box system. And it's a shame that nothing like that is here. So in closing, Team Sonic Racing feels like a really great idea that's a lot of fun in execution, which has sadly been heavily undermined by Sega just not wanting to invest that much into it. So as a result, we have a final product that has a limited character roster, and we have UI and menus which just look dull and cheap, especially when compared to the previous titles. And this is illustrated quite well when you look at what happens when you win a Grand Prix in TSR compared to what happens when you win a Grand Prix in All-Stars Racing Transformed. In Transformed, you get a nice podium sequence in which all the characters are present and they congratulate you. In Team Sonic Racing, you get this near static image. Everything in Team Sonic Racing feels like a step down from the previous title, and you're constantly thinking, I wish this was Racing Transformed 2. And then you have to remember the key point. Team Sonic Racing isn't a strict sequel to Transformed. It's an attempt to make a completely new experience, which is also nearly half the price of what Transformed was at launch. And this for me is what Team Sonic Racing's biggest problem is. It was made to be a budget title. You cannot deny that when it's compared directly to the previous game, it seems to lack content. It feels like a much cheaper game. But if you judge it on the actual price point that it's currently available for, I personally was able to get it for barely £25, and I've seen other retailers selling it for a similar cost. This is almost half of what I paid for All Stars Racing Transformed when that came out. And compare the price of this game to other new games today. It's a very cheap budget title. So with that in mind, yeah, I'm not surprised that when you compare it directly to the previous game, it does feel less. Now that doesn't mean it's a bad game. It's not a bad game, not in the slightest. It's a very fun game, and I do strongly recommend it. But at the same time, I cannot shake those memories of the previous title. I can't deny that I just wish it had the same scale, the same money put into it as All Stars Racing Transformed did. I'm sat here thinking, I wish this was a true sequel to All Stars Racing Transformed. So the final word on this? Team Sonic Racing is a very good and very fun game, which I highly recommend. But it has a cooler dad that I wish it was more like. See you next time. Straight online and ruin it for everyone. Oh no! Oh no! No! It's not yet working! We can't ruin it! The Sega Ninjas! This is a conspiracy! Hey guys, thanks for checking out my video. If you found this video interesting and enjoyed it, please click that like and subscribe button. And if you know anybody else who might be interested, please share it with your fellow friends and minions. If you want to continue the adventures, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And if you'd like to support the work I do further, please consider backing me on Patreon. Or if you'd just like to make a one-off donation, why not treat me to a coffee? Links to both are in the video description. Even the smallest donation is a huge help to keeping this channel going. But most of all, just thank you for taking the time out to watch this video and enjoy the work I do. It really does mean the world to me. Thank you.